The voicemail from my mother was 42 seconds of perfect, polished composure. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine ticking as it cooled in the humid dark of the cul-de-sac, and played it for the 4th time. Her voice didn't shake. There was no tremor of maternal hesitation, no crack in the porcelain. "Grant," she said, her tone the same one she used to dismiss a caterer who had oversalted the hors d'oeuvres. "I've spent the afternoon moving your remaining things into the garage. I think we've both realized that this arrangement isn't tenable. I simply won't house a failure, dear. It's bad for the atmosphere, and frankly, it's bad for my standing. I've arranged for a service to collect the key from the mat tomorrow. Please don't make this a scene. We're finished here." The phone screen dimmed, casting my face in a gray, ghostly light. I looked at the house, the colonial-style fortress where I had grown up, where the lawn was manicured with the surgical precision of a cemetery. My mother, Lydia, was likely sitting in the library right now, sipping a chilled white wine and feeling the immense relief of a pruned branch. I was the excess. I was the academic researcher whose contract had been dissolved because a board of directors in a city 300 miles away decided my department was a luxury they could no longer afford. To the university, I was a line item. To Lydia, I was a social contagion. I didn't go to the door. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe hard. I just sat there, gripped by a cold, analytical clarity. My mother lived for the optics of success. In her world, a son who lost his position was a son who had ceased to exist in any meaningful capacity. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. I drove until I found a public park 3 miles away, a place where the shadows were deep enough to hide a mid-sized sedan. That night, the back seat became my bedroom. It had a funny thing, the architecture of a car. You never realize how many hard angles and plastic protrusions exist until you're trying to find a place for your hip bone. I used a bundled-up coat for a pillow and watched the streetlights filter through the glass, thinking about the concept of institutional memory. In my work as a historian, I tracked how societies forgot their mistakes. Now, I was the mistake being forgotten. The next morning, I went to a public gym. It was 5:30, the air smelling of chlorine and stale effort. I paid for a day pass, showered in a stall that lacked a curtain, and shaved in a mirror that made my skin look like gray parchment. I dressed in my best remaining suit, a charcoal wool that still held the faint scent of my former office. I spent the day at the public library, not because I had a job, but because the library provides the illusion of purpose. I sat at a mahogany table and opened my laptop, looking at the wreckage of my professional life. I was 32, an expert in the curation of national narratives, and currently possessed exactly $1,200 and a car that needed an oil change. I applied for 19 positions by noon. I didn't look for entry-level roles. I looked for the pillars. I looked for the roles that required a certain type of academic ruthlessness. Between applications, I checked the local social feeds. I saw a post from a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose primary hobby was monitoring the property values of our street. "So sad to hear about Grant," the caption read, under a photo of a sunset. "Lydia tells us he's off getting help somewhere else. We're all rooting for his recovery." I stared at the words. Recovery. It was a masterpiece of social engineering. By framing my professional collapse as a personal breakdown, a health struggle, Lydia had neutralized the embarrassment of my failure. She wasn't the mother of a loser. She was the long-suffering matriarch supporting a troubled soul from a distance. She had rewritten my history while I was still living it. I felt a surge of something that wasn't anger. It was too cold for anger. It was the feeling of a curator discovering a forged document. I realized then that my mother didn't just want me gone, she wanted me rebranded. 3 days later, I was still in the car. The novelty of the gym shower had worn off, replaced by a permanent ache in my neck and the sour taste of cheap coffee. I had become invisible. It's remarkably easy to vanish in a city if you keep your tie straight and your shoes shined. People see the suit and assume the man inside it has a destination. They don't see the gym bag in the trunk or the way he lingers in the grocery store just to stay in the air conditioning. I drove past the house on Friday evening. There were cars lined up along the curb, the sleek European models of Lydia's social circle. She was hosting a gathering. I parked a few houses down, tucked behind a large oak tree. I rolled the window down just an inch. The sounds of the party drifted across the lawn, the high, melodic tinkle of crystal glasses, the low murmur of practiced laughter. I saw Lydia through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. She was wearing her pearls, her posture perfect as she held court. She looked radiant, unburdened by the weight of a disappointing son. I saw her neighbor, the one who had posted about my recovery, lean in to say something. Lydia touched the woman's arm, her expression turning performatively somber. She shook her head slowly, a gesture of tragic grace. "He's in a specialized facility," I imagined her saying. "It's for the best. We just want him to find his way back to himself." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the leather. She was using my absence as a currency to buy sympathy and status. I was the ghost she used to haunt her friends into admiring her strength. I looked at my phone. No new messages from employers, no leads. Just the silence of a deleted life. I realized that if I disappeared tomorrow, the narrative she had constructed would be the only one that remained. I would be the cautionary tale, the hushed footnote in the annals of the neighborhood. The sarcasm that usually bubbled up in my mind felt heavy and sharp, like a blade. I thought about the way she had described me, a failure. To Lydia, failure wasn't an event. It was a permanent state of being. It was a stain that couldn't be washed out, only hidden away in the garage or a facility. I started the car and began to drive away, but then I stopped. I looked at the house one last time. The lights were so warm, so inviting. It was a theater of belonging, and I was the only member of the audience who knew the actors were lying. I drove back to the park and spent the night planning. I didn't plan for a confrontation, not yet. I didn't have the leverage. In the world of prestige and reputation, you don't win by shouting. You win by becoming the person who decides what the truth is. I spent the next week in a fever of calculated activity. I didn't just apply for jobs, I began to curate myself. I scrubbed my digital presence of anything that looked like desperation. I spent my remaining money on a high-end mobile hotspot and a premium subscription to an industry database. I spent 18 hours a day in the library, not as a job seeker, but as a strategist. I looked for the gaps in the local institutions, the museums, the historical societies, the foundations that Lydia and her friends used as their social playgrounds. On the 10th day, the air in the car felt particularly stagnant. I was sitting in a parking lot, eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard, when my phone vibrated. It was an email from the National Museum of History and Culture. "Dear Mr. Grant," it began, "your recent analysis regarding the restructuring of regional archives has reached our board. We are currently looking for a senior curator to oversee our new permanent exhibit on social power and legacy. Your background in the mechanics of institutional memory is exactly what we require." I read the email twice, then a third time. It wasn't just a job. It was an authority. It was a role that would put me at the center of the very circles Lydia spent her life trying to impress. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were tired, and there was a hardness in my jaw that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. I looked like a man who had been erased and had decided to draw himself back in with darker ink. I thought about the voicemail. I won't house a failure. I pulled a notebook from the passenger seat and wrote down a single phrase. The curator determines what is worth keeping. I spent that evening watching the house again from a distance. I watched the lights go out one by one until only the porch light remained. Lydia was in there, sleeping soundly in the belief that she had successfully managed her greatest liability. She thought she had closed the book on me. She didn't realize that I was simply starting a new chapter, one where she wasn't the narrator anymore. I put the car in gear and drove toward the gym. I needed to be ready for the interview. I needed to be flawless. As I drove, I found myself humming a low, tuneless song. The silence of the car no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a workshop. The social exile she had imposed on me was supposed to be a punishment. She wanted me to wither in the dark, to be the invisible man who eventually drifted away into insignificance. But she had forgotten one thing about historians. We are very comfortable in the dark, and we know exactly how to find the things people try to bury. I thought about the rehab rumors, the specialized facility, the performative pity she was enjoying at her dinner parties. I would let her keep those stories for now. I would let her build her house of cards as high as it would go, because when I finally returned, I wouldn't be coming home as a son. I would be coming as the person who held the keys to everything she valued. I parked the car, adjusted my tie in the dim light of the cabin, and stepped out into the cool night air. The air tasted like rain and iron. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. The first stage was over. The collapse was complete. Now, the reconstruction would begin, and I would make sure every stone was laid with a purpose. The museum's guest bathroom was a marble-lined sanctuary of expensive soaps and soft lighting, a significant upgrade from the flickering fluorescent tubes of the 24-hour gym. I stood before the mirror, adjusting the silk tie I had purchased with the very last of my savings. My skin had lost that sallow, automotive gray, replaced by the healthy glow of a man who slept in a bed with high thread count sheets and ate meals that didn't come in crinkling plastic wrappers. I looked like authority. I looked like the kind of man people leaned toward in hopes of absorbing a bit of his relevance. Landing the senior curator position at the National Museum had been a masterclass in narrative control. During the interviews, I hadn't mentioned my mother, or the fact that I had been living out of a trunk. I spoke of strategic sabbaticals and independent research phases. I presented my displacement not as a crisis, but as a choice. The board members, men and women who lived in the same rarefied air as Lydia, found my calm confidence intoxicating. They saw a man who was unshakable. They saw a curator who understood that the past was merely a lump of clay to be molded by the victor. As I walked through the grand foyer toward my new office, my footsteps echoed against the polished limestone. The museum was a temple of curated truths, and I was now one of its high priests. My primary task was the Legacy and Power exhibit, a project designed to examine how the great families of the region had maintained their influence through the decades. It was a role that granted me access to archives, guest lists, and social registries that were normally guarded like state secrets. I sat at my desk, a heavy slab of dark oak, and opened my laptop. I didn't check the museum's internal memos first. Instead, I checked the social feeds of my mother's neighborhood. Lydia was active. There were photos from a charity luncheon she had hosted for the Friends of the Arboretum. In the pictures, she looked regal, her arm linked with Mrs. Gable. They were laughing, surrounded by floral arrangements that likely cost more than my car was worth. The comments were a predictable stream of platitudes. "So wonderful to see you doing well, Lydia," one read. "You've been so brave this month. How is Grant doing in his program?" Lydia's response was a masterpiece of vague maternal concern. "He's making progress every day. It's a long road, but we remain hopeful. Privacy is so important during these transitions, as I'm sure you all understand." I felt a thin, sharp smile touch my lips. She was still selling the story of my recovery. She had built a fortress of lies to protect her reputation, never imagining that the person she was burying was currently sitting in an office that overlooked the city's cultural heart. I was no longer a ghost in her garage. I was a ghost in the machine of the very society she worshipped. The erasing of my existence had been thorough. I had received a letter from her lawyer a few days prior, a formalization of the separation of assets. It was a polite way of saying that my childhood home was legally closed to me, and any attempt to return would be treated as a trespass. She wasn't just moving on, she was paving over the site of my life. I spent the next several weeks operating with surgical precision. By day, I was the rising star of the museum. I moved through galas and board meetings with a practiced ease, making connections with the city's power brokers. I met with the editors of local magazines and the directors of philanthropic foundations. I was careful to never mention Lydia. I wanted my rise to be entirely separate from her, a towering structure that would eventually cast a shadow so long it would swallow her whole. By night, I lived in a sleek, minimalist apartment that smelled of new paint and expensive wood. I didn't buy many things. I didn't want clutter. I wanted my environment to reflect my mind, organized, cold, and entirely focused on the objective. I spent hours at my dining table, mapping out the social connections of Lydia's circle. I used the museum's archives to find old newspaper clippings, property records, and forgotten scandals. Society, I realized, was like an old building. If you knew where the load-bearing walls were, you could dismantle the whole thing without ever using a hammer. You just had to remove the right screws. My first move was subtle. I invited Mrs. Gable's husband, a man who sat on the board of a local historical society, to a private tour of the museum's restricted archives. He was a bore of a man, obsessed with his own lineage, but he was a direct conduit to my mother's inner circle. "Grant," he had said when I greeted him in the lobby, his eyes widening in genuine shock. We heard you were away, dealing with some personal matters." "I was away on a research fellowship," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any defensive edge. I gave him a look of mild, scholarly confusion. "I'm not sure where the other rumors started, but you know how things get distorted in small circles. I've been quite busy setting up the new department here." I saw the gears turning in his head. He was comparing the man in front of him, the senior curator of a national institution, with the image of the troubled son in rehab Lydia had been peddling. The discrepancy was jarring. I didn't push it. I simply showed him the archives, treated him with a level of professional deference that made him feel important, and sent him on his way. I knew exactly what would happen next. He would go home, tell his wife, and the whisper campaign would begin. But this time, the whispers wouldn't be about my failure. They would be about Lydia's honesty. The second phase of my reconstruction involved institutional influence. As the curator of the Legacy and Power exhibit, I was responsible for selecting the families who would be featured in the Modern Influence section. It was a highly coveted honor. Being featured in the National Museum was the ultimate validation of social standing. Lydia's family had been a fixture in the local historical records for generations. Under normal circumstances, she would have been a prime candidate for inclusion. I made sure her name was on the initial list, knowing that the committee would look to me for the final vetting. I waited until a board meeting in late October. The room was filled with the scent of expensive coffee and the quiet rustle of high-end stationery. "We have the preliminary list for the Heritage Wing," the museum director said, gesturing to the screen. "Lydia's family is included here. They have a significant history in the textiles industry, don't they, Grant?" I leaned back, tapping a pen against my chin with a look of thoughtful hesitation. "They do," I said quietly. "But I've been reviewing the recent social audits and public records. There seems to be some inconsistency regarding their current public standing. Some concerns have been raised about the transparency of their recent philanthropic activities. In an exhibit titled Legacy and Power, we have to be very careful about who we present as a standard bearer. We want stability. We want a narrative that isn't clouded by personal complications." The room went silent. In these circles, complications was a word that carried the weight of an indictment. I didn't provide details. I didn't need to. By casting a shadow of doubt, I had effectively made Lydia's inclusion a risk. The board members, ever fearful of being associated with anything less than perfection, nodded slowly. Perhaps we should move them to the under-review pile, the director suggested. We can revisit them if the situation clarifies. I think that's wise, I said. I felt a thrill of cold satisfaction. With a few sentences, I had blocked the one thing Lydia wanted more than anything: institutional immortality. I had used my position to quietly erase her from the history I was writing. But the most important part of the rebuild was my own public debut. The museum's autumn gala was the social event of the season, a televised affair attended by the governor, the mayor, and every socialite within 100 miles. Lydia would be there, of course. She would be wearing her finest dress, prepared to play the role of the dignified mother of a missing son. The week before the gala, I began to receive voicemails. "Grant? It's your mother," her voice said in the first one. She sounded annoyed, but not yet panicked. "Mrs. Gable mentioned she saw you at the museum. She seemed to think you were working there. I assume there's been a misunderstanding. Please call me back. We need to coordinate what we're saying." I didn't call her back. The second voicemail was more urgent. "Grant, I'm serious. People are talking. I heard from the Historical Society that our family archive is being reevaluated. What have you done? If you're trying to embarrass me, I promise you it won't work. Call me." I listened to it while sitting in my office looking out at the city lights. I deleted it without a second thought. The third voicemail, left the night before the gala, was different. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "I know you're there. I know you're doing this on purpose. You think you can just step back into this world after I've spent months cleaning up your mess? You are nothing without the name I gave you. If you show up at that gala tomorrow, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what you are." I smiled. She was finally starting to understand that the rules had changed. She thought she was the one who controlled the light, but I was the one who owned the shadows. On the night of the gala, the museum was transformed. Searchlights swept the sky, and a red carpet stretched from the curb to the massive bronze doors. Photographers lined the walkway, their flashes popping like miniature bursts of lightning. I arrived in a black car, stepping out into the flurry of activity. I wasn't just a guest, I was the host. As the senior curator, I was the one who would be giving the keynote address. I was the one who would be photographed with the dignitaries. I moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. I was a vision of success, composed, articulate, and entirely in control. I saw the looks on the faces of people who had known me as the struggling researcher. They looked at me now with a mixture of awe and confusion. And then, I saw her. Lydia was standing near the grand staircase, her hand gripping a glass of champagne so tightly her knuckles were white. She was wearing a deep emerald gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, but the mask was slipping. Her eyes were wide, fixed on me as I moved through the room. She looked like someone watching a ghost come to life. I didn't go to her. I didn't even acknowledge her. I continued my conversation with the head of a major television network, laughing at a joke I didn't find funny. I could feel her gaze burning into the side of my face, a desperate, silent demand for attention. When it was time for my speech, I stood at the podium, the lights of the cameras blindingly bright. I looked out over the sea of faces, finding Lydia in the middle of the crowd. She looked small. For the first time in my life, she looked truly insignificant. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing through the hall with perfect clarity. "Tonight, we celebrate legacy. But we must remember that a legacy is not something you are born with. It is something you build, piece by piece, through your actions and your integrity. It is something that can be lost in an instant if it is built on a foundation of sand." I held her gaze for a split second longer than was polite. I saw the realization dawn on her face. She realized that I wasn't just back. I was the one who was now in charge of her legacy. As I stepped down from the podium to thunderous applause, I felt a hand on my arm. It was a reporter from a local news outlet. "Mr. Grant, a quick word?" she asked, her microphone poised. "You've made an incredible rise in such a short time. What would you say to those who doubted you?" I looked past her to where Lydia was standing, surrounded by people who were now whispering and pointing in her direction. I saw the neighbor, Mrs. Gable, lean away from my mother, her expression one of cool detachment. The narrative was shifting. The recovery story was over. The new story was about a mother who had tried to hide a successful son for reasons no one could fathom. "I would say," I replied, my voice calm and final, "that the truth is the only thing that survives the passage of time. Everything else is just noise." I walked away, leaving the reporter and my mother behind. I had rebuilt my world, and I had done it without a single apology or a single moment of mercy. I was the curator now, and I was just getting started. The morning after the gala, the museum was a tomb of silence and expensive dust. I arrived at 6, long before the cleaning crews or the docents, and sat in my office with a cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt ambition. On my screen, the digital edition of the city's primary newspaper featured a photograph of me at the podium. I looked composed, formidable, and entirely detached from the world of the small and the petty. The headline was a simple affirmation of my new reality, a new vision for the National Museum. Senior Curator Grant outlines the future of heritage. My phone had been vibrating intermittently since dawn. Lydia's name appeared on the screen, a persistent ghost in the circuitry. She had stopped leaving voicemails. Now, she was simply calling, over and over, as if the sheer repetition of the act could force a response from a void. I watched the screen glow, then go dark, then glow again. It was a rhythmic, mechanical desperation that I found oddly soothing. The museum director, a man named Sterling who moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, stepped into my office at 9. He was holding a physical copy of the paper, his finger tapping the image of my face. He didn't offer a greeting. Sterling was a man who viewed pleasantries as a waste of billable seconds. "The board is ecstatic, Grant," he said, taking a seat opposite me. "The governor's office called 40 minutes ago. They want to discuss a state-level advisory role for the Heritage Commission. You've managed to turn a dry academic post into a seat of genuine cultural authority in less than a month. It's an impressive bit of theater." "It's not theater, Sterling," I replied, setting my coffee down. "It's curation. People want to believe in a narrative that feels inevitable. I simply gave them one." Sterling smiled, a thin, paper cut of a smile. "Quite. However, I should mention that we've had some inquiries. A woman calling herself your mother's representative has been trying to reach the archives, something about recovering family records that were supposedly mismanaged during your appointment. She's being rather insistent." I didn't blink. I didn't let a single muscle in my face betray the cold satisfaction blooming in my chest. "My mother has a very specific relationship with history, Sterling. She believes it belongs to her personally. I've already instructed the archives to hold all family-related assets for a formal audit. We can't have the museum's integrity questioned by personal interests, can we?" Sterling nodded, his eyes lingering on me with a newfound respect. He knew I was lying, and he respected the quality of the lie. "Of course. Neutrality is our greatest asset. Keep the archives locked down. I'll tell the front desk that all inquiries regarding your family's legacy are to be routed through your office directly." When he left, I felt the weight of the leverage I had created. I wasn't just avoiding Lydia anymore. I was bottlenecking her existence. Every social and historical avenue she used to validate her standing now had to pass through a gate that I guarded. I spent the afternoon in the Legacy and Power Wing, watching the installers place the glass partitions for the upcoming exhibit. The space was airy and light, designed to make the viewers feel as though they were walking through a dream of progress. I stood near the back, in the shadows of a large granite pillar, and watched the patrons. It happened around 3. I saw a familiar silhouette enter the gallery. It was Lydia. She wasn't wearing the emerald gown from the night before. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, her shoulders squared, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she was walking into a battle she intended to win. She looked around the room with a proprietary air, as if she could reclaim her status by sheer force of presence. She didn't see me at first. She approached a young docent, her voice carrying across the quiet room, a controlled, melodic weapon. "I'm looking for the Senior Curator's office. I was told he was down here in the wing." The docent, a girl no older than 22, blinked at her. "Mr. Grant is in a closed meeting, ma'am. If you have an appointment—" "I don't need an appointment to speak with my son," Lydia said, her voice sharpening just enough to make the girl flinch. "Tell him Lydia is here, now." I stepped out from behind the pillar. "That won't be necessary, Sarah," I said. The docent looked relieved and scurried away. Lydia turned, her face a mask of carefully applied makeup and suppressed rage. For a moment, we simply stood there, two strangers in a hall dedicated to the past. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the expensive cut of my jacket and the way the museum staff moved around me with quiet deference. "You've been busy," she said. Her voice was low, meant only for me. "I have a demanding role, Lydia. I'm sure you understand the pressure of maintaining a reputation." She took a step closer, her perfume, something floral and expensive, clashing with the sterile scent of the museum. "Don't you dare play this game with me, Grant. I know what you're doing. Mrs. Gable won't return my calls. The Historical Society has postponed my honorary chair position. You're whispering in ears, poisoning the well." "I haven't whispered a thing," I said, my voice calm and conversational. "I've merely been doing my job. I'm a curator. I look at the evidence. If the evidence suggests that a family's standing is built on a narrative that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, it's my professional obligation to note that. If your friends find that troubling, perhaps the problem isn't the messenger." Lydia's hand twitched, as if she wanted to reach out and strike me, or perhaps grab my lapel and drag me back to the car where she could hide me away again. "I did what I had to do, Grant. You were a mess. You were a liability. I protected the family name." "You protected yourself," I corrected her. "You threw me into the street because you were embarrassed by a budget cut. You told everyone I was in a facility because you couldn't bear the thought of being the mother of a man who was between contracts. You didn't protect the name. You tried to edit me out of the record." "And look at you now," she hissed, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "You've landed on your feet. You're the star of the season. So why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin me?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, no desire for her approval. She was just a specimen, a relic of a fading era that I was in the process of cataloging. "I'm not ruining you, Lydia. I'm just letting the world see you without the benefit of my silence. You spent 32 years teaching me that the most important thing is how the story is told. I'm simply a very fast learner." She took a breath, her chest heaving slightly. "What do you want? Is it money? Do you want the house back? I can make arrangements. We can put out a statement, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. We can be a family again." The offer was so hollow, it almost echoed. She was trying to buy her way back into a position of safety. She didn't want a son. She wanted a public relations solution. "I don't want the house," I said. "And I certainly don't want a statement. I want you to go back to your luncheon, Lydia. I want you to sit with your friends and wonder which of them has already heard the truth. I want you to feel that cold, creeping sensation that the floor beneath you isn't as solid as you thought it was. I want you to understand that I am the one who decides what stays in the archive and what gets discarded." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the first flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of violence. It was the fear of a woman who realized she was being dismantled by a system she no longer understood. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," I replied, checking my watch. "I'm a curator, and I have a 4 o'clock meeting with the media liaison. You should leave. You're starting to attract attention, and we both know how you feel about a scene." She stood her ground for a second longer, her jaw tight, then turned on her heel and marched toward the exit. I watched her go, her heels clicking sharply against the stone, a fading rhythm of a life that was slowly being erased. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. That would have been too emotional, too messy. I felt a sense of completion. The surveillance phase was over. I knew where her vulnerabilities lay. I knew that her entire identity was tied to the institutional validation that I now controlled. Later that evening, as the sun set over the city and cast long orange shadows across my office floor, I received a notification on my computer. The media liaison had sent over the draft for the museum's quarterly journal. The lead article was about the Legacy and Power exhibit. I scrolled down to the section on local families. Lydia's family name was gone. In its place was a blank space, a placeholder that would eventually be filled by someone more stable. I picked up my phone and saw a text message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my old car, the one I had slept in, parked in the lot of the public park. The message read, "I still have the pictures of where you were. Don't think you can hide the truth forever." I deleted the message. I wasn't hiding the truth. I was the one defining it. I stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, I could see the lights of the neighborhood where Lydia lived. It looked like a cluster of diamonds on a velvet cloth, glittering, cold, and entirely fragile. I thought about the dinner invitation I would send her in a few weeks. It wouldn't be an olive branch. It would be a summons. I would bring her into my world, on my terms, and I would let her see exactly how much of her life I had moved into the garage. The weeks following the gala were a study in the quiet accumulation of gravitational force. In physics, if you increase the mass of an object, it naturally pulls smaller bodies toward it. In social dynamics, I was becoming a sun, and Lydia was a satellite whose orbit was decaying. My office at the museum had become a hub of quiet, influential activity. I was no longer just a curator. I was a gatekeeper. I spent my days vetting the histories of the city's elite, deciding whose ancestors were worthy of the spotlight and whose would be relegated to the climate-controlled obscurity of the basement vaults. I began to reconnect with the old neighborhood, but not as the son who had been discarded. I returned as a man of institutional consequence. I accepted an invitation for coffee with Mrs. Gable at a small, overpriced bistro near the museum. She arrived fluttering with nerves, her silk scarf tied a little too tight, her eyes darting to the lanyard around my neck as if it were a royal seal. "Grant, dear, you look marvelous," she said, her voice a fragile trill. "We were all so surprised. The news about your appointment. It's quite the prestigious turn." "Surprised?" I asked, my voice smooth, tilting my head with an expression of mild curiosity. "I'm not sure why. I've been working toward this for a decade. My research phase was quite intense, of course, but the results spoke for themselves. I suppose some people might have misinterpreted my absence as something else." Mrs. Gable flushed a blotchy pink. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lydia, well, she gave us the impression that you were unwell. In a clinic. For the nerves," she said. "We all felt so much sympathy for her, having to carry that burden alone." I laughed softly, a dry, rhythmic sound that didn't reach my eyes. "My mother has a vivid imagination, Mrs. Gable. She's always had a flair for the dramatic. I think she found the reality of my contract negotiations far less interesting than the story of a tragic wayward son. It's a common trait in people of a certain age. They prefer a narrative they can control over a truth that ignores them." I watched the information sink in. I wasn't just refuting the lie. I was pathologizing the liar. By the time the check arrived, I knew Mrs. Gable would be on the phone before she even reached her car. The recovery story was being replaced by a much more delicious piece of gossip: the delusional mother who had tried to sabotage her successful son out of sheer, jealous vanity. I continued this process with a surgical lack of emotion. I met with the head of the Historical Society, where Lydia held her honorary chair. I didn't ask them to remove her. I simply shared a confidential audit of the family's archival contributions, pointing out several gaps in documentation and concerning discrepancies in the provenance of certain donated items. I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the National Museum was hesitant to partner with any organization that lacked a rigorous standard of historical integrity. 3 days later, I received a notification that Lydia's chair had been indefinitely suspended pending an internal review. The messages from Lydia changed again. They were no longer angry, they were panicked. "Grant, I don't know what you're telling these people, but you have to stop," she said in a text message. "The club has asked me to take a leave of absence. People are looking at me differently. I saw Sarah Gable at the market and she wouldn't even meet my eye. You're making me look like a fool." I looked at the screen and felt a deep, resonant sense of order. She had once told me that she wouldn't house a failure. Now, she was discovering that the world felt the same way about a liability. She was becoming the very thing she had tried to erase. One evening, I decided to visit the old house. I didn't go as a supplicant. I drove my new European sedan, the one the museum's salary package made effortless to maintain, and parked it directly in front of her driveway. I didn't ring the bell. I simply walked the perimeter of the property, my hands in my pockets, looking at the windows. The house looked smaller than I remembered. It was a well-maintained box of secrets and curated silences. I saw the curtain in the library twitch. Lydia was in there, watching me, trapped in the fortress she had used to lock me out. I didn't wave. I didn't gesture. I just stood there for 5 minutes, a physical presence she could neither ignore nor command. My existence was now an undeniable fact that her lies could no longer contain. When I returned to my car, I felt the air around me grow heavy with the proximity of the endgame. I had stripped away her social armor. I had blocked her access to the institutions that gave her life meaning. I had turned her peers into observers of her decline. There was only one thing left to do. I had to let her see the full scale of the change. I spent the next week preparing for the dinner. I didn't choose a restaurant. That would have given her the safety of a public space. I chose my own apartment. I wanted her in my environment, surrounded by the minimalist precision of my new life. I wanted her to feel the absence of her influence in every polished surface and every shadow. I sent the invitation via a formal card, hand-delivered to her door. It was a single sentence. "I've curated a final evening for us. Please arrive at 7 on Thursday." The days leading up to the dinner were the most productive of my career. I finalized the Legacy and Power exhibit, ensuring that the section on family collapses was particularly detailed. I included a display on the social erasure of the individual, using anonymous case studies that were, in reality, detailed accounts of how Lydia had treated me. I was turning my pain into a professional masterpiece, a permanent record of her methods that would be read by thousands, though they would never know her name. On Thursday, I prepared the apartment with a focus that bordered on the obsessive. I didn't want the warmth of a home. I wanted the sterile clarity of a gallery. I arranged the lighting so that the dining table was a bright island in a sea of dim gray. I placed her phone on the table, not her actual phone, but a replica I had prepared to demonstrate a point. I wanted her to see how easily things could be substituted, how easily a reality could be faked. The buzzer rang at exactly 7. I waited 30 seconds before answering, letting the silence of the hallway press in on her. When I opened the door, Lydia looked older. The lines around her mouth were deeper, and her eyes had a frantic, darting quality that reminded me of a bird trapped in a room. She was wearing a black dress, a mourning color, though she would never admit what she was mourning. "Grant," she said, her voice thin. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the room, looking for a weakness, a mess, a sign of the failure she still wanted me to be. She found nothing. The apartment was as flawless as a vault. "Welcome, Mother," I said. I led her to the table. I didn't offer her a drink. I didn't take her coat. I treated her with the polite, distant professionalism of a curator handling a delicate but ultimately unimportant artifact. We sat in silence for a moment. The city hummed outside the window, a distant world that no longer belonged to her. I watched her look at the table, at the sparse, elegant setting, and finally, at me. "This has gone far enough," she said, trying to summon her old authority. It was like watching a ghost try to move a heavy chair. The effort was there, but the substance was gone. "You've had your fun. You've shown everyone you're successful. Now tell me what you want so we can put this behind us. I'm prepared to offer you a formal apology, if that's what this is about." I leaned back, interlacing my fingers. "An apology? Lydia, you're thinking in such small terms. An apology is for an accident. This wasn't an accident, it was a choice. You chose to delete me because I was no longer a useful asset to your brand. You didn't apologize for the voicemail. You didn't apologize when you told the neighborhood I was a shadow in a clinic." "I was protecting us," she snapped, her voice cracking. "I couldn't have people thinking my son was just another unemployed academic living in his childhood bedroom. It would have ruined everything I worked for. And look at where that work has led you," I said softly. "You're suspended from your boards. Your friends are whispering that you're unstable. The archives that hold your family name are being audited for fraud. You tried to manage the truth, but you forgot that the truth is a living thing. You can't just lock it in a garage and expect it to stay there." She reached for the phone on the table, her movements jerky. "I'm calling your father's attorney. This is harassment. This is—" She stopped when she realized the phone was a prop. It was a hollow shell, a piece of plastic that looked real but had no function. She stared at it, her breath coming in shallow hitches. "You're surrounded by things that look real but aren't, Lydia," I said. "That's the world you built for me. I'm just inviting you to live in it for a while. This evening isn't about reconciliation, it's about placement. I want you to understand exactly where you are in the new narrative." She looked up at me, and I saw a tear track through her makeup, a single line of salt and charcoal. "What are you going to do to me?" "Do?" I asked, genuinely amused. "I'm not going to do anything. I've already done it. I've simply finished the curation. Your life, as you knew it, is now an exhibit in the past. I've moved the walls, changed the lighting, and rewritten the labels. You're not the matriarch anymore. You're just a woman who used to be someone." I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound was final, like the closing of a heavy door. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. I felt light, as if I had finally shed a weight I had been carrying since birth. "The dinner is over, Lydia," I said without turning around. "You can let yourself out, or you can sit there and look at the plastic phone. It makes no difference to the record." I heard her move, the rustle of her dress, the hesitant click of her heels. She didn't say another word. She couldn't. I had taken the one thing she needed to fight back: her audience. She was alone in a room with a man who no longer recognized her as a mother, only as a subject. When the door finally clicked shut, I didn't move. I stayed by the window, watching the lights of the city. I thought about the car, the gym showers, and the cold clarity of the library. I thought about the historian I used to be and the architect of reality I had become. The long way out was finally over. I wasn't just surviving. I was the one who decided what survived. The air in the apartment was perfectly still, cooled to a precise 68 degrees by the silent climate control system. It felt like the interior of a pressurized cabin or a high-end vault. I sat across from Lydia at the dining table, the single overhead light casting a sharp white circle on the mahogany surface between us. The rest of the room was swallowed by shadows, making the world feel as though it had shrunk to the size of this one table, this one confrontation. Lydia had not eaten a single bite of the food I had prepared, a meticulously plated arrangement of cold poached salmon and asparagus, chosen for its lack of steam and its visual rigidity. She sat with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her shoulders were hunched, her breathing shallow and audible in the vacuum of the room. She looked at the prop phone I had placed on the table as if it were a ticking device, her eyes darting from the plastic shell to my face and back again. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her voice a thin, reedy ghost of the authoritative tone she had used on that voicemail weeks ago. "If you wanted me to see your success, I've seen it. If you wanted me to feel regret, I suppose you've achieved that too. But this theatricality, it's beneath you, Grant. It's cruel." "Cruelty requires a lack of purpose, Lydia," I said, my voice leveled at a professional monotone. "I'm not being cruel. I'm being thorough. When a curator organizes an exhibit, they don't leave the old, discredited labels lying around. They remove them. They ensure the viewer isn't confused by conflicting information. I'm simply ensuring the information is clear." I stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate. I walked to the door of the apartment and turned the lock bolt. The metallic thunk echoed through the space, a sharp, final punctuation mark. I saw Lydia flinch, her gaze snapping toward the door. "Why did you lock it?" she whispered. "Because we aren't finished with the tour," I replied. I walked back toward the table but didn't sit down. Instead, I reached out and took her actual phone from where she had set it near her handbag. She made a small, aborted gesture to stop me, but I was faster. I didn't turn it off. I simply placed it face down on the table and rested my hand on top of it. "You spent 30 years controlling the flow of information in our family. You decided who was a success, who was a failure, and who was allowed to be seen. Now, for the next hour, I am the one who controls the signal." I felt the vibration of a notification beneath my palm. It was likely a message from one of her few remaining allies, perhaps Mrs. Gable asking for more details on the rehab story, or a panicked query from the Historical Society. I didn't look at it. I simply let the vibration finish, a muffled buzzing against the wood. "Give that back to me," Lydia said, her voice rising in a desperate attempt at indignation. "You have no right to touch my property." "Property," I mused, looking around the room. "That's an interesting word. You considered my presence in your house a matter of property rights. When I was no longer an asset that increased the value of the estate, you disposed of me. You didn't see a son, you saw a depreciating investment. So I've taken the liberty of diversifying your portfolio." I walked to the sideboards and picked up a tablet, swiping it open. I turned the screen toward her. It showed a digital map of her social network, a web of nodes and connections I had mapped out using the museum's data tools. "Do you know what happens to a network when the central node is compromised?" I asked. "The peripheral nodes begin to detach. They look for a new center. In the last 48 hours, I have contacted every major donor to the Arboretum, every board member of the Heritage Commission, and the editor of the Regional Social Register. I didn't tell them you were a bad person, Lydia. I didn't have to. I simply provided them with the verified professional records of my tenure here, contrasted with the health struggle narrative you've been distributing." I swiped the screen. They don't like being lied to, not because they care about me, but because being caught in a lie makes them look unpolished. It makes them look like they lack discernment. By using them to validate your story, you made them part of the forgery, and no one in this city hates anything more than a forgery. Lydia's face had gone a strange, sickly shade of ivory. The realization was finally sinking in. I wasn't just taking my life back. I was dismantling the infrastructure of hers. I was removing the load-bearing walls of her reputation, one by one, with the same cold efficiency she had used to pack my things into the garage. You're going to lose everything, she breathed, her eyes wide. If you do this, you'll be just as alone as you think I am. Who will you have, Grant? Who will care about your promotions and your exhibits when there's no one left who knows where you came from? I know where I came from, I said. I came from a car. I came from a gym shower at 4 a.m. I came from the silence of a library where no one knew my name. I've already been alone, Lydia. I've already been erased. You're the one who hasn't tried the experience yet. I'm just giving you a preview. I walked to the window and pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, plunging the room into even deeper isolation. The only light now was the single bulb over the table, making Lydia look like a figure in a Caravaggio painting, exposed, shadowed, and caught in a moment of irreversible transition. "This is revenge," she said, her voice cracking. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that arrived too late to change the outcome. I looked at her, and for a moment, the sarcasm and the coldness softened into a terrifyingly sharp clarity. No, Lydia. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is a reaction. This is curation. This is the process of deciding what is worth preserving and what is merely clutter. You taught me that a legacy is a deliberate construction. I'm just finishing the work you started. You wanted a son who was a success, a son who was an authority, a son who understood the power of the record. Well, here I am. I leaned over the table, my face inches from hers. I could see the fine tremor in her eyelids. I've spent the last month documenting your methods. Every voicemail, every text, every lie you told the neighbors. I've compiled it all. It's not for the police, it's not for a lawyer, it's for the archive, it's for the people who will write the history of this city. When they look for the name of your family 50 years from now, they won't find a matriarch. They'll find a case study in social manipulation and professional sabotage. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade away. Lydia looked down at her hands, which were now shaking visibly. She looked broken, not in the way a person breaks from a physical blow, but in the way a statue breaks, when the internal stress becomes too much for the stone to bear. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want you to do anything," I said, straightening up. "The time for doing is over. I wanted you to sit here. I wanted you to eat this meal. I wanted you to feel the weight of a door being locked from the inside. I wanted you to understand that for the rest of your life, whenever you walk into a room, you will wonder if the people there have seen the archive. You will wonder if they are looking at you, or if they are looking at the complication I've made you." I picked up her phone and handed it back to her. My hand was steady, my touch light. I didn't feel the surge of adrenaline I had expected. I felt a profound sense of relief, the kind one feels when a long, tedious project is finally being filed away. "You can go now," I said. "I've unlocked the door remotely." She didn't move at first. She stared at the phone in her hand as if it were a foreign object. Then slowly, she stood up. She didn't look at me again. She walked toward the door, her steps heavy and uneven. She looked like a woman who had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. As she reached the door, she paused. She didn't turn around. "I suppose you think you've won." "There is no winning in history, Lydia," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table. "There is only the record, and the record is now closed." She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. I heard her footsteps retreat down the carpeted corridor, fading into nothingness. I sat there in the silence, the single light still burning bright over the table. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the salmon. It was perfectly seasoned, cold, and exactly what I had planned. I looked at the empty chair across from me. The exhibit was almost complete. There was only one final piece of placement left. One final turn to ensure that the narrative remained exactly where I wanted it. I thought about the next day, the meetings at the museum, the expansion of my influence, and the way the world would continue to turn, oblivious to the fact that one small, private history had just been rewritten forever. I finished my meal in the quiet. I felt no regret. I felt no mercy. I only felt the immense, satisfying weight of the truth. The finality of a closed door is a sound I have come to appreciate as a specialist in endings. After Lydia left my apartment, the silence that remained was not empty. It was occupied by the weight of a completed task. I spent the following morning at the museum, walking through the nearly finished galleries of the Legacy and Power exhibit. The laborers were polishing the glass cases, their movements rhythmic and steady. I stood before the central display, a collection of letters and documents from the city's founding families, and felt a profound sense of equilibrium. I had successfully transitioned from a man who was acted upon to the man who took the actions. But the curation was not quite finished. There was one final setting to manage, one last confrontation to ensure that the placement was irreversible. I knew Lydia would return to the house, the colonial fortress that represented her last remaining claim to stability. She would retreat there to lick her wounds and attempt to draft a new counter-narrative. I did not intend to give her the luxury of a private recovery. I arrived at my childhood home at dusk. The sky was a bruised purple, the streetlights flickering to life with a low electrical hum. I didn't park down the street this time. I pulled my sedan directly into the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the white columns of the porch. I stepped out of the car, the cool evening air carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. I walked up the steps with a key I had never actually returned, the one she had left on the mat which I had retrieved and kept as a placeholder. I entered the house without knocking. The interior smelled of beeswax and expensive loneliness. I found Lydia in the library, the very room where she had likely sat while recording the voicemail that started this process. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, a glass of water on the table beside her, staring at the empty fireplace. She didn't look up when I entered. "I told you once that I curated my life," I said, my voice cutting through the stagnant air of the room. "I told you there was no room for relics. I meant it, Lydia." She turned her head slowly. The defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow, glassy stare. "You've already taken everything, Grant. My standing, my friends, my position. Even my name feels like it doesn't belong to me anymore. What could you possibly be doing here now?" "I'm here to ensure you understand the permanence of the change," I said. I walked to the mahogany desk, her father's desk, and placed a small, leather-bound folder on the blotter. "These are the final transfer documents for the historical estate. Because of the inconsistencies I found in the family archives, the board has determined that the primary residence and its contents are to be placed under a protective trust. As the senior curator of the overseeing institution, I have been appointed as the primary trustee." Lydia stood up, her movements brittle. "You're taking the house? You're turning me out?" "I'm not turning you out," I replied, my voice devoid of heat. "I'm simply reclassifying the space. You can stay for now. But you will stay as a guest in an institution I control. You will live among the artifacts of a life you no longer own. Every time you walk through these halls, you will remember that the only reason you are here is because I have allowed the record to remain incomplete for a while longer." She walked toward me, her hands trembling. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of the sun she used to command. She found only the polished surface of a professional stranger. "Is this what you wanted? To see me like this? Reduced to a tenant in my own home?" "I wanted you to understand the nature of leverage," I said. "You used your power to make me invisible when I was at my lowest. You didn't do it out of necessity. You did it for the optics. I am doing this for the same reason. The optics of my new role require that I handle the family legacy with a firm, objective hand. If that leaves you in a diminished position, it is merely a logical consequence of the history you authored." She looked around the room, at the rows of books and the portraits of ancestors who would never speak for her again. "You are so cold," she whispered. "There is nothing left in you but this calculation." "I am what you curated, Mother," I said. using the title like a sharp instrument. You pruned away the parts of me that were soft. You discarded the parts that were loyal. You kept the part that was observant and the part that understood how to survive in a vacuum. You should be proud. I am your most successful project. I turned to leave, but she reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of my coat. It wasn't a caress. It was a desperate, grasping movement. Wait, just tell me, is there any way back? Is there any version of the story where we find a way to fix this? I stopped and looked back at her. The sarcasm that had sustained me through the nights in the car and the long hours in the library rose up, but I suppressed it. Sarcasm was for the defensive. I was no longer on the defense. The thing about history, Lydia, is that once a page is turned, the ink dries. You can't rewrite a chapter just because you don't like the ending. You can only choose how you live in the aftermath. I walked out of the library and through the foyer. She followed me, her footsteps echoing mine, a frantic shadow trailing behind a solid object. As I reached the front door, I stopped and turned one final time. She was standing under the chandelier, the light highlighting the wreckage of her composure. She looked like an actress who had forgotten her lines in the middle of a play that had gone on far too long. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer one last plea or one last insult, but nothing came out. I curated my life, I repeated, my voice a calm final vibration in the hallway. And in the final version, the one the world will see, there is no room for you. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very long sentence. Lydia appeared at the window beside the door, her face pressed against the glass. She didn't tap on it. She didn't scream. She just watched me. I walked down the steps, my gait steady and sure. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was behind me. A house that was now a museum, and a woman who had become a relic. I got into my car and started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a constellation of modern, functional lights. I put the car in gear and drove down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. I turned onto the main road, the colonial house disappearing from my rearview mirror. The city lay ahead of me, a vast landscape of narratives waiting to be shaped. I felt a sense of immense, quiet power. I had survived the exile. I had rebuilt the foundation, and I had executed the plan with a precision that left no room for error. The cycle of betrayal and humiliation was over. I was no longer a character in someone else's drama. I was the author of my own. As I drove toward the museum, I thought about the Legacy and Power exhibit. It would open to the public in 3 days. Thousands of people would walk through the halls I had designed, reading the labels I had written, and absorbing the truths I had chosen to present. They would see the rise and fall of families, the mechanics of influence, and the inevitable erasure of those who lacked the strength to hold their position. I was the one who controlled the light. I was the one who decided what was seen and what was forgotten. I reached the museum and parked in my reserved spot. I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the quiet tick of the engine as it cooled. I felt no need for reflection. I felt no need for closure. The work was done. The placement was perfect. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the staff entrance. The night air was sharp and clear. I looked up at the massive stone facade of the institution, a fortress of memory that I now helped command. I felt a thin, controlled smile touch my lips. I entered the building, the doors sealing shut behind me with a heavy pressurized hiss. I walked through the darkened galleries, my footsteps the only sound in the vast, curated space. I was home. The story was over. The record was complete. There was nothing left to say.